Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you. Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up. And check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Edward Slingerland. He has a new book called Drunk, How We Slipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. He goes by Ted. So, Ted, welcome to the podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, tell me about a little bit about your background and how you came to author books, and then I want to talk about this new book that you have.
Well, I'm a professor of early Chinese philosophy, is my main specialty, in comparative religion. So my early academic work focused on early Taoism and Confucianism, and then I got into doing more cognitive science and humanities, cognitive science of religion, and just started branching out more and more into the sciences. So actually, I'm now in a philosophy department, but I'm also adjunct in psychology and hang out mainly with psychologists these days. So I've had a kind of strange career path. But yeah, I wrote my first trade book, came out in 2014. It's called Trying Not to Try, about this early Chinese ideal of effortless action, or wu wei. It's kind of like being in the zone in sports where you relax, you're completely unself-conscious, but everything works out perfectly and people trust you and like you, and everything happens the way it should. And it's about the tension involved in that ideal. So hence the title, Trying Not to Try. How can you try not to try? I explain why it's a paradox and then walk people through the various ways that these early Chinese thinkers tried to get around the paradox.
Well, why did, if we can just delve into it for a moment, why did they propose this paradox, and how is the concept useful now that you've studied it and written a book on it?
Well, they didn't so much propose the paradox as just get stuck in it, right? So they have as their ideal, it's an alternative ideal. One of the things I point out, it's an alternative ideal to, let's say, recent Western philosophy. So, and I think in general in Western culture, we have this kind of idea that any goal worth achieving is something that you have to work really hard for and strive and keep trying and try, and you'll eventually get it. And if you're not successful, you should just try harder. And that's sometimes true, but it's sometimes not. So there are important. I argue in the book there actually the early Chinese were right about this. That there are some important goals like happiness or trust or love that you can't achieve, or creativity, creative insights that you can't achieve through just kind of forcing your way from A to B. You've got to relax and let it happen. But it's hard to relax. If you know that you need to relax and you're trying to relax, it's actually completely counterproductive. So they get involved in this tension just because they happen to have spontaneity as an ideal. But I'm arguing in the book that it actually is a helpful concept for us, because I think once it's pointed out to people that there are a lot of goals that you need to actually be relaxed to do well for, they see the point. They realize that you're right. But because we don't have a word for this state, and because we tend to emphasize more striving and trying, I think it's a kind of blind spot for us. And so that's one way in which these early Chinese thinkers can be helpful.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of examples of this. Like I remember Caesar Milan. He was like the dog whisperer, and he would always tell people you got to be calm and assertive. So they would have to take control, but not be frenzied or angry about it.
Yeah.
And then I've seen it in other examples too about, going to sleep. You can't say, go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep.
Yeah. That's the example I use a lot. Yeah.
Well, remember the movie Kung Fu, I think it was Kung Fu Panda 2, where he goes, inner peace, inner peace, inner peace. That's hilarious. You should force inner peace into himself.
Yeah. So. There's a very funny Onion article about that, where this guru contest where they're trying to out meditate each other, and the guy who wins starts pumping his fist and he says, "I am the most serene. I am the most serene." It's kind of it points out this kind of tension between being goal directed and trying, and the state where to be really in it, you have to kind of let go of the goal at some level.
Okay. Well, how did the concept for the book Drunk come about? Were you drinking one night and it came up, or how did it come to?
It's actually, so my colleagues were a bit baffled by the topic, but it actually grows organically out of my previous work. So one connection is this first tension, this try not to try tension. The reason that it's a paradox is that, let's say you're trying to fall asleep, you have insomnia, and you say, go to sleep, go to sleep. The part of your brain you're activating is actually the part you need to shut down in order to fall asleep. So you're activating the very thing you want to downregulate. And so that's why it's actually directly a paradox. It's just built into the structure of the brain, essentially. So these early Chinese thinkers come up with various indirect ways around this tension. So sit like this, sit in meditation a certain way, or do breathing exercises, or do this ritual. They have various kind of ways to trick you in a way out of thinking about the tension. But it occurred to me at one point, one of these early texts uses drunkenness as an analogy of the spiritual state they want you to get into. And it started to occur to me that, maybe, drunkenness is actually a form of this state. And, maybe chemical intoxicants in general, but really alcohol in particular, are a cultural technology that cultures have devised to get around this paradox. Because if you're trying to use your brain to shut down your brain, that's a paradox. If you can just sip something and it will go inside and turn down your prefrontal cortex, that's a way around the tension. And so one of the main functions of alcohol is to essentially relax you, to downregulate your executive function. And the prefrontal cortex is the main site of that in the brain. So it's kind of some people would view it as a cheat, but it's actually kind of clever workaround. It's a way to use this external substance to induce psychological state that's very difficult to induce directly by yourself.
Well, it's I think it's akin to like using CBD or drinking coffee to get yourself, creative juices flowing, or, smoking weed. I'm sure if you do too much of any of these, then it debilitates you. You can't function, but maybe a little bit, perhaps using the right way would help you.
Yeah, those are very different substances, though. Cannabis has some that is in the same class. So the drunk is primarily about intoxicants. So that would include alcohol and cannabis. So substances that downregulate your prefrontal cortex, depress certain parts of your brain, release some positive hormones. Whereas something like caffeine is in a way the enemy of alcohol. It's actually strengthening your PFC. So stimulants are a very different type of drug. And we tend to use those not so much to get the creative juices flowing. They tend not to work very well for that. What they work well for is getting you working on something. So getting you sitting in front of the computer and focusing. They're good. So stimulants are good for tasks where it's a very clear ABC progress where you just need to put in the time and put in the effort to do it, and stimulants help you to do that. Where intoxicants like cannabis and alcohol come in handy, and again, as you said, in the right doses. And so, talking drunk about some of the experimental work on this, and it looks like to capture most of the benefits of intoxication with alcohol, you want to get to about 0.08 blood alcohol content. So that's like maybe 2 beers, depending on how big you are and if you've eaten or not. So just about when you shouldn't be operating heavy machinery is when you start to get these positive effects like enhanced creativity. And so alcohol and other intoxicants are useful in situations where going from A to B to C isn't what you need to do. You need to think of Z. You need to think of this completely different thing. So psychologists call this lateral thinking. So you're trying to think of something completely different or make a connection between things that's unusual. Caffeine's not helpful. Nicotine's not helpful for something like that. You really need something that relaxes the hold of your prefrontal cortex so that your brain relaxes and different regions start talking to each other when they feel like it. And there's no playground monitor strictly in charge anymore.
So is the book about historical examples of this, or is it a guidebook on how one could use alcohol for the creative process, or what's the focus of it?
So there's a couple purposes of the book. The first is to just debunk the standard scientific story about why we have a taste for intoxicants. So the standard story is that we take alcohol as an example. We like to drink alcohol because ethanol, the alcohol molecule, happens to trigger a reward network in our brain. And so there's no good reason for it. It's just we figured out a trick where we get a reward from evolution essentially by triggering this reward network. And of course, once we figure that out, we do it all. That's sometimes I refer to that as an evolutionary hijack. So it's where we're hijacking a reward system that evolved for other purposes. There's also stories about alcohol where it's a evolutionary mismatch. So this is a slightly different type of mistake where maybe our taste for alcohol was adaptive at one point long time ago in our history, but it's not anymore. And so one example of that is this dirty water hypothesis that, before we had good sanitation, drinking water was often unsafe. But if you ferment it into beer, it's safe to drink. And so the idea that, having a taste for alcohol kept you hydrated without getting sick from bad water. And so the first part of the book is basically just debunking all of those stories. So I'm arguing our taste for alcohol can't be an evolutionary mistake. And that's because it's ancient. So it's been around for a really long time, probably at least 20,000 years. Definitely, we have direct evidence 13,000 years ago. It's so sometimes evolution doesn't have time to fix something, but it's had plenty of time to fix this. And it's also really costly. So unlike some other evolutionary hijack mistakes, our taste for alcohol is dangerous. Alcohol is bad for our bodies. It increases our cancer risk. It damages the liver. It's super addictive. It's kind of getting up near cocaine, heroin levels of physical addictiveness. Probably a good 15% of the population has a genetic propensity toward alcoholism and can't use alcohol safely. So I'm arguing, given how ancient this taste for alcohol is and how widespread it is across the world and how costly it is, there's got to be adaptive benefits that are paying for the costs. So one of the main points of the book is just to argue that the story we've been told about why we like to drink is wrong. So that's the kind of main theme. And then I spend a chunk of the book, I talk about history, but history just in terms of illustrating how different cultures have used alcohol to attain these various functions. And I talk about several, but the two big ones are individual and group creativity. So individual creativity and then kind of group innovation is the big one. And the other one is bonding. So it's helped people get beyond cooperation dilemmas and mistrust and cooperate in situations where you need to trust the other person. So those are the two big ones. And there's a few other minor ones.
So for the 85% of people that don't have a propensity to get addicted, should they use it? Like, I don't know. What if I had a corporate brainstorming session? Should I get everyone a little tipsy and maybe the brainstorming session would go better?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, that's
be practically used in people's lives.
Yeah, so I give some examples. One is when I gave a talk about this was early stages before I really started doing the research for the book, at one of the Google campuses. After the talk was over, the first guy raised his hand and told me about, first of all, the Ballmer peak. So this is probably apocryphal, but the claim is that Steve Ballmer, the former Microsoft CEO, discovered that there was a certain blood alcohol content, very specific blood alcohol content, where his coding ability was like supernatural, but he had to stay right at that level. He couldn't go over it. And so he supposedly would hook himself up to a alcohol IV to keep himself right at whatever 0.17 or whatever the BAC level was. And then afterwards, they took me on a campus tour, and the first place they took me was their whiskey room. And so they said when they're, as a team, when they run into a wall, when they've been working on a project and they run into a wall, they don't know what to do next. They need an insight. So sitting in front of their computers, drinking more and more coffee is not helping. They go to the whiskey room, and they had this amazing collection of single malt scotches. I was actually very jealous. And some, beanbag chairs and a foosball table. And they just go in there and pour themselves a scotch and sit and talk. And they said that often after probably about 0.08, as they're kind of halfway through that first scotch, ideas start to flow. And also, you're getting new ideas when you depress the PFC. You're also, since your inhibitions are lower, you also blurt things out. You say things that you maybe would be a little embarrassed about or not sure of. And that's good for group creativity. And so corporations use this in a very practical way. I've used it in a very practical way. This actually isn't in the book. When I was writing the proposal, I went through about 10 different versions, and my agent every time sent it back and was like, "This is not good." She's from Manhattan. She doesn't sugarcoat things. So she was like, "This is boring. It's not good." And she was right.
So, have a drink or two and then reconsider.
Yeah, so what I realized was that I had all the science there, I had all the history, all my arguments were in place, but I hadn't taken my own advice. I hadn't actually written any of it while drinking. And so I was on this business trip. This was pre-COVID. And I had about 2 hours before I was supposed to meet my colleagues for dinner. And so I took my laptop and went down to the hotel bar and ordered a Negroni. And by the end of Negroni number 1, words started coming. And the experience was like I was taking dictation. It really didn't feel like I was writing this stuff. It was just coming to me. And what I wrote that evening became pages 1 through 2 of the book and the beginning of the proposal. And everyone who reads the book loves that section because it sucks you in and it's because it was written at about probably 0.08, maybe 0.10 BAC. So yeah, I mean, there are practical ways where you can strategically use alcohol when you need a creative insight.
Are there substances that are just as good as alcohol, but in a different way to spark creativity, or it was enough to focus on alcohol solely for this book?
I talk about cannabis also can have this function. So, and some people use it for that purpose, right? So there's, I talk about the history of how alcohol has been associated with artists and poets and writers, and so has cannabis. So cannabis can be used this way too. And cannabis has some advantages over alcohol. So it's not as physiologically damaging as alcohol. And it's also not physically addictive. It can be psychologically addictive, but it's not physically addictive. And so in some ways it's a better drug, but it's not in every way. And the two problems with cannabis are that individuals really vary in their response to cannabis. So I have friends who smoke pot and want to get really creative and want to talk about philosophy and want to go dancing or chat about stuff. When I smoke cannabis, I get super paranoid and then I fall asleep. And now that cannabis is legal in Canada and many states, and you can get any variety you want, everyone's been, oh, you just had the wrong strain. You have to have this type of sativa. And I've tried every strain. Every strain does exactly the same thing to me. So this is a problem because if you want to pick a drug to be that's why you don't have a cannabis room at Google. You have a whiskey room because alcohol has much more consistent effects on people across individuals. You know what's going to happen.
Yeah, but I guess at lower levels, yeah. At higher levels, you always have those friends that would cry, or ones that would get violent, or ones that would annoy the heck out of you. So I've seen that alcohol is also very varied, but that's probably at a higher level.
That's at
old fraternity days.
Yeah, that's at a higher level, and it's not variable in the effect. It's actually consistently disinhibiting people. What's varying is to the extent to which their disinhibited self is like their sober self. And in many people, their disinhibited self is just kind of happier, looser version of their sober self. In other people, when they get disinhibited, some really dark things come out. But that's not because alcohol is having a different effect on them. It's because they have a different relationship to cognitive control. But it's pretty consistently disinhibiting people across individuals.
Okay. Any additional nuance to this, like certain types of alcohol better, certain mixes, beer because it's it's carbonated. Does it affect people differently than, let's say, scotch or whiskey?
No. So ethanol is ethanol. That's the main active ingredient. But it does matter what kind of dose you get. And so one of the arguments I make in the book is that alcohol has gotten more dangerous relatively recently, especially considering this long, probably 20,000 year history we've had with it. So one problem is I call isolation. So it's the fact that we now have the ability to drink alone. So historically, private access to alcohol was pretty rare. If you wanted to drink, it was always in a social environment. And drinking has always been surrounded by these norms, ritual regulations about when you pass around the cup or when you can toast and have a drink. Even in really informal situations, modern situations, like if you think about a pub, going to the pub with your friends, you're still typically drinking in rounds. So if you down your beer really fast and you want another one, you gotta wait until we're all finished and we order another round. So there are all these ways we can regulate each other when we're drinking socially. But, when you have the ability with COVID, you could start ordering, you can have liquor delivered to your house, right? You can not even leave your house and have, a case of vodka delivered to your house. That's crazy. Like having private access to that much alcohol is just not something we're culturally or genetically really adapted for. So one danger is this isolation. The other is distillation. So alcohols always historically come with this kind of built-in safety feature that it could only get to a certain strength because then the yeast is at a certain point, the alcohol shuts the yeast down and they're not producing alcohol anymore. And we've been ruthlessly pushing yeast to get more and more tolerant so we can make stronger and stronger beers and wine. But the best you can get now is kind of 16, maybe 17% ABV with some kind of crazy Australian reds. But that's still not super strong. But humans figured out distillation at a certain. We've known about distillation for a long time in theory. It actually is kind of pretty hard to pull off in practice on a large scale because you need to master all these different technologies like metallurgy or glass blowing and keeping things at a constant temperature. But once we figured out how to do it on a large scale, you remove that safety feature that alcohol has always had, and you can make, vodkas come in 90-something% ABV. And that's in the West, that only happened a couple hundred years ago. So 1600s, 1700s is when you start getting distilled liquors available to your average person. And distilled liquors are really a whole another story. You got to be really careful with them. So, in the whiskey room, you got to be drinking just one whiskey. It's the alcohol in a distilled liquor is so much more powerful. It's very easy to blow past the sweet spot of 0.08 and get really dangerously drunk very quickly. Whereas for most of our evolutionary history, the stuff we've been drinking has been 2 to 3% ABV beers. And something like that you can drink all day and never really get beyond 0.08. So ethanol is ethanol. It doesn't matter how it's delivered to you, except that the dosage matters. And you got to really be careful about distilled liquors because they're so much more powerful.
From what I remember, there was the rise of coffee houses, I guess Lloyd's of London and all that, I believe in the 1600s. Why do you think that happened? Why did alcohol go wrong? Was it overused? I've also heard, I guess historically, hundreds of years ago, because of water purification, that beer, let's say, was the safest mead, like a very weak, watered down mead. So perhaps people were buzzed all the time. Again, historically, how is alcohol used well and not used well?
Yeah. So I don't know if the coffee house phenomenon was a reaction to the gin craze. So like in London, there was this period in the 1700s where there was this gin epidemic. So I think the Dutch were dumping this really cheap gin on England, and people it caused this epidemic. And we've seen instances of these kind of epidemics once you get distilled liquor. So another one is Russia in the 1990s. Kind of post-Soviet Union, there was just really epic alcoholism and abuse of vodka. So it may have been a response to that. It was also partly just, it was a novel substance. It was this new drug, and it was great for a lot of stuff. If you want to, really focus and talk about a topic, coffee is a great thing to have. And people still use coffee this way. People still meet over coffee. And yet, in European cafes and coffee shops, they're not as segregated as they are, for instance, in North America. So in North America, you either go to a coffee shop or you go to a bar. In Europe, it tends to be a lot more mixed. So you've got your choice of substances, and you see people shifting their choice depending on the time of day, depending on what the purpose of the interaction they're having is. So alcohol can be used. There are ways, I argue, to use alcohol safely. Especially if you use it in a way where you're doing it socially, you're doing it as a part of a meal, you're not drinking to excess, and so you have social norms that kind of make it shameful to overdrink rather than kind of something that's cool to do. And you see that cultures that have these more healthy drinking habits, so typically Southern European cultures like Italy or Spain, have, even though they drink a lot of alcohol, so Italy per capita drinks a lot of alcohol, they have very low incidence of alcoholism. And I don't think it's because they're genetically any different than Germans or Russians. And that, I think it's just that they have more healthy norms about drinking. So we can point to some cultures that kind of do a better and worse job of integrating alcohol safely into their lives.
Yeah, I used to hang out with a bunch of people from Ireland when I worked for Intel like 20-something years ago, and hanging out with them, they would drink all night, but they would drink slowly. and everyone
Yeah.
kind of had a good time. It wasn't like let's drink to get effed up and
Yeah.
to fall down. And it seemed like a much healthier way to do it, even though it was a lot of alcohol,
Yeah.
but it was better.
Yeah, and they're probably drinking, not super strong ales and beers, so that also helps. But yeah, cultures, these Northern European drinking cultures where it's a bunch of guys typically, and they're drinking hard alcohol, and they're drinking to get drunk. There's no food. The purpose is to get drunk. That's a really unhealthy drinking culture. And you see that in Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, and then, the colonies from those places. So I think the U.S. and Australia and New Zealand have inherited that kind of unhealthy drinking culture to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's how I would characterize it. It was just a healthier, more sociable way to do it. So yeah, makes exact sense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what were some of the big learnings for you, or did readers come back to you and say, "Oh, what we really thought this part of the book was great or useful"?
I learned a lot doing the research for it. So the distillation thing was new to me. I just kind of, I don't know, I guess I always assumed we always had distilled liquors. I didn't realize how recent a thing that was, especially in Europe. I was surprised about how long we've been producing alcohol. So, I was consciously taught this, or just assumed it, that, first we had agriculture, and then at some point we left some stuff sitting around, bread making stuff sitting around, and it fermented, and we tasted it and thought it was cool, and we discovered beer. When I started digging into the archaeological literature, it seems like it's actually the other way around. So hunter-gatherers were getting together, building this massive monumental architecture, having these feasts, doing some kind of religious ritual. We really have very little idea what they were doing. And drinking. They were drinking, probably, we're almost certain it was beer, and maybe even beer laced with hallucinogens. And so I talk in the book about this beer before bread hypothesis, that it was actually the desire to get more and better intoxicants that led hunter-gatherers to settle down and start civilization. So there's a really literal way in which intoxication led to civilization. And so that was very surprising to me. In terms of reader feedback, there's the expected, the whole last part of the book is about how dangerous alcohol is. And the whole premise of the book is, given how dangerous alcohol is, why do we still use it? But, I still get the expected angry things from people, which, understandably, people who are recovered or recovering alcoholics, or the parent, children of or friends of people who have drinking problems, who are outraged that I'm celebrating alcohol as something positive. And, it's hard to know how to respond to.
Well, they say like the biggest jerks are like former smokers, if you're a smoker.
Yeah, maybe. It's understandable though. I don't think it's, and they're usually actually quite polite about it in a sense. They just, say, are really concerned about this, this theme in your book. But I do think that, a lot of other people have said to me, thanks for, I think one of the things that maybe the most common response I've gotten is, I knew that there was a function to drinking, and I never really knew what it was. I had trouble articulating it. And so it's helpful to actually see what the purpose of it is. And I think that one of the helpful things of the book is that once you see what the historic functions of alcohol have been, and kind of scientifically how it can change your cognition in various ways, you just have a better ability to make a decision, intelligent decision, about what the role of alcohol should be in your life or in your organization. And so getting to see, because right now when we talk about alcohol, it's purely through this medicalized lens where it's just all about physiological impact. And it's just too narrow a way to look at it. That is all that physiologically negative stuff is true. But you have to then see that on the other side, there's these positive individual and social functions.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So any feedback from readers that, again, wasn't upset with you, but like real positive feedback or surprising feedback that you received?
Yeah, I mean, that's the main one. It's just, I think most kind of consistent positive feedback is I knew the substance had a role in my life, and that it wasn't just a vice, that, I wasn't just doing it because I'm addicted and, pushing this pleasure lever over and over again. I knew I was doing it for a reason, and now I have, I know what that reason is, or set of reasons are. And that then allows people to start using alcohol intelligently and strategically. In the way that I did when I realized, version 11, if I just wrote version 11 of the proposal the way I was doing the other 10 versions, it would not be much better. It wouldn't be qualitatively better than the earlier versions. I realized I needed a 0.08 writing session. And so having that awareness of the function of alcohol, people have written to me, or they've realized, this is why, on a date, you get a glass of wine because you're nervous and you want to relax and you want to be more open and less judging. And it's why, people at the end of workday have a drink sometimes to kind of make that transition, caffeine-fueled work life, to, a different mode of interacting with people and being in the world. So, yeah, I think the most consistent positive feedback has been, now I can articulate what alcohol is doing for me. And before, I just had a vague idea.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, very good. Ted, any hints at a new book coming, or, is this so recent that you need to just take a break for a while, or what's next?
No, the next book's an academic monograph. But the next trade book, the next book that normal people want to read, is going to be on hedonism. So, purpose of pleasure and the varieties of pleasure, and
the research for that one's going to be really tough.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I'm going to try to rehabilitate the term hedonism, because in English it's got these negative connotations of kind of going wild and overindulging in sex and drugs and food. And I'm arguing for hedonism in the original Greek sense, which was pleasure, but for the early Greek hedonists were actually really pretty boring. Like you wouldn't invite them to a party, because they thought that the highest pleasure was contemplating the truth. And, then there were other pleasures were debate and kind of, reading, and they were really worried about drinking and eating and stuff like that, and sex, because they thought those were fleeting and not actually true pleasures. And so hedonism, I want to try to, I guess kind of the way I was trying to rehabilitate alcohol and drunk, I want to kind of defend hedonism by articulating a more sophisticated form of it than we typically have.
Yeah, there was a book that came out the past couple of years by Robert Lustig, and he's normally just a hardcore scientist. He talks a lot about diabetes, metabolic syndrome, but he talks about the difference between pleasure and contentment in terms of, the type of happiness. So that might be a good resource for you to look at.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I should check that out.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, very good, Ted. So, can people get your book anywhere books are sold, or, where can they get the book?
Yeah, anywhere. So my website's just my name, edwardslingerland.com, and it's got, interviews, reviews, links to my other books, and my books are available everywhere. So where it sells books. And the paperback is coming out next week, I think, soon. Paperback is coming out this month. So
it'd be cool if you can get bars to carry the book. When they have
right.
Version,
yeah.
No, I have. Talks on that.
Yeah, I've done a couple. I've done more than one winery or brewery talk where they were selling copies of the book. So yeah, it's a natural fit. Yep.
Okay. Well, Ted, it was great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the podcast. And a very curious book. I'll have to check it out. And thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.